Can't you just feel it? The conflict is becoming apparent in our culture. It reminds me of those words of John Paul II. We're now living in the final confrontation between the gospel and the anti-gospel, between the church and the anti-church, between Christ and the antichrist. And if we don't choose to know God's word, to believe God's word, and follow God's word, we're going to be a sitting duck for all kinds of confusion, all kinds of disorder. Those are really important choices that people have to make.
And these choices are difficult. Who am I going to marry? What kind of life am I going to live? How am I going to raise my kids? What am I going to do with my time, my talent, and my treasure? And I have to make a choice today. Jesus says to each one of us, I came that you might have life and have it to the full. The question is, do we want it? Welcome, friends, to another week of The Choices We Face. We're here again this week with Dr. Monique Ruberu. And if you didn't have a chance to tune into the program last week where she told her story, she's a happily married mother of 5. She talked about that. She talked about her work with women's health. She's an obstetrician gynecologist. She's a pro-life doctor who's been trained in NaPro Technology, which we're going to focus on a little bit more today. But you can go to our YouTube channel at renewalministries.net. You can get last week's program. It was really fantastic. But welcome back, Doctor.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to be back again.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, before we get into understanding NaPro Technology, which I do want to talk quite a bit about today, if we can, just the work you're doing, is you said something toward the end of the program that you touched on just a little bit last week about the moment or the time when you really began to fall in love with Jesus, and that the depth of your conversion. I wonder if you want to share a little bit more about that and then how it affected your marriage and your family as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So at the time that my husband and I were going through a very, very challenging time in our marriage where I felt like we were literally on the brink of divorce, it was such a dark time in my life. I had always been a very happy, joyful sort of person, but at this moment, I was just in the depths of darkness. And at that time, there was no love between my husband and myself. It was just very empty. And I realized through the gift that God had brought all these other people into my life and the examples that they had shown me and the things that they had shared with me, I realized that every single person, myself included, we have these God-sized holes. And when we ask God to step into those holes and to fill them, He's the only one that can fill them. We try and fill them with people. We try and fill them with things. We try and fill them with experiences. And that may bring temporary happiness, but it's only when we welcome God in and we ask Him to fill our holes that we can be complete.
What do you mean? Can you give an example, like what a hole might be? You know,
so,
like you say,
like when you're feeling like you can't be alone. Like I know so many women who are constantly going from one relationship to the next, to the next, to the next, and they feel like they just can't be alone. And I was kind of like that. In my relationships in my life, I had, several different relationships growing up. And then I got married. And when our relationship broke down and I felt so alone, what I finally realized is that I never had to be alone if I had Jesus. And when I invited Jesus into my life and I completely fell in love with Him, and I realized that with Him, I didn't need anyone else. I no longer needed my husband. I didn't need my children. I didn't need anything. Didn't need my job for joy. Everything became a bonus. And it was such a gift because it wasn't that I didn't want them or that I didn't desire them or choose them. But now I was coming to them from a point of, if you don't love me, that's okay. I can still choose to love you. But I don't need you to love me for me to be at peace because God loves me. And that's all I need. I just needed God to love me the way that He does so perfectly, and for me to feel His love palpably. and I didn't need anything else.
How did that change like your prayer habits in your life, but also your relationship with your husband, and where was he and how did he respond to that reality emerging in your life?
It was such a transformational time in my life. I went from this cafeteria Catholic who literally just checked the box and didn't have a relationship with God at all, except when I needed something, to somebody who I couldn't read enough about God. I wanted to go to mass. I wanted to engage in prayer groups. I wanted to talk to people about God. I was happiest when I was discussing God. All of my happiest moments were when I was praising God with my friends. And even to this day, I would say that's still true. The people that I love spending time with the most are the people that I can praise God with. And it just brings me so much joy. I would seek out opportunities to like go for conferences where they were talking about God. So I felt like I had so much to learn, so much to catch up on, because our faith is so beautiful and there's just so much to know.
Yeah. And now some husbands, when they see that, like, what just happened or what's happening to her? Like, wait a minute. Is this from going from bad to worse or what's happening in our marriage? You know?
I was so blessed to come across Joanne Benkovic's story. And she had a very similar conversion where she went from being like a total cafeteria Catholic to an on-fire Catholic. And her husband like thought that she had gone insane and he would treat her really badly until one day he had a massive conversion. And the entire time in her relationship when this was going on, God kept telling her to just spend time and love on him and to leave him to God and that God would work it out. So having that example really gave me confidence that although I was in a completely different place from my spouse in our faith journeys at that time, I trusted that God would somehow bring us to the same place.
How would you describe practical ways in which you began to relate differently to your husband in those moments, knowing what God was doing in you?
Absolutely. So understanding the importance of priority, understanding that I had to put God first and then my spouse and then my kids and then everything else, I became very vocal about that. Like I would talk to people about it. I would say things in front of my husband and in front of my children. Like, okay, yes, God is first in our lives and then comes Tati, which means husband or father, then comes the children, then comes everything else. So when he came home, like meeting him, greeting him, knowing that we would have to have this date night once a week. So even if we were arguing, we had to figure it out by date night because we had to go and do something fun together. Just spending time looking for the beautiful things about him, remembering all of the things that brought us to that position, focusing on the beauty of our relationship and really starting to learn how to put things in the past and move forward and just live in the now rather than trying to live in the past. And
putting things in the past, were there moments of like reconciliation to say, I didn't know what I didn't know, you know what I mean? Absolutely. Or I just see things so differently now, honey. Can you?
Absolutely. Yeah. Having the ability to have a conversation with somebody and actually take ownership for your part in the breakdown in the marriage. Because it's very easy to point fingers at other people. But then when I realized I had no sense of priority in the marriage, and when I had children, it was absolutely children were at the top and God was somewhere on the side and my spouse was somewhere at the bottom because he could change. He didn't have diapers and he could eat and all that sort of stuff. So understanding that as a wife, I needed to prioritize him next to God really helped me to just be more compassionate to him and to be grateful for everything that he was doing to provide for us as a spouse and to be able to just really enjoy one another. Yeah, the decision to love. I mean, that's what you're saying, that really is a decision. I think it's typical, it seems like, for human beings to say, well, I don't feel the way I used to feel, so it's over. You know what I mean? Or it doesn't have a future, or I'm not as attracted to you as I used to be, or something like that. And so my wife and I have talked to us. We wrote a book called Lessons from the School of Love, just to say a priest gave a homily at my daughter's wedding, and she and her husband to be chose 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind. And this priest he's given the homily, he goes,
Okay, let's look at this. Love is patient. Yeah, love is kind. And it gets to the part where love never fails. And he stops. He goes, seems to me that love fails all the time. And the whole church just kind of froze. Like, what a buzzkill. What's this guy saying? And he said, God's love never fails. And he turned to them and he said, now you guys you're learning how to love. And that's great.
Yeah.
You're entering the school of love now. Marriage is it's a school of love where God is going to teach you how to love because we don't know how to love. And that's what the Lord wants to teach us. And out of that will come life. So that's exactly what your story is describing. It's beautiful.
Absolutely. And when you look at the example that God gave us, everything that Jesus did for us was a sacrifice for us. Mm-hmm. And so it's the perfect example of how a husband and wife should act to one another, right? In order to have a marriage that really works, the wife has got to die unto herself for her husband. Mm-hmm. And the husband has to die unto himself for the wife. Yeah. You have to be willing to sacrifice all of your personal desires for the betterment of your spouse and to make sure that your spouse makes it to heaven. Yeah. And it's only in your willingness to allow them to take care of you and to take care of all of your needs and make sure that you're well cared for and leaving aside your own desires and knowing that they have got your back.
Yeah, well said. That's good.
Will make your marriage just the strongest ever.
Yeah, and most of us don't instinctively either get there on our own or sort of believe it when you first hear it.
Right.
Yeah. But it's actually the way of the Lord. It's the way of a disciple, and he's totally trustworthy. And so let's talk a little bit about your work as well. And what is NaPro Technology? What is it?
So NaPro Technology is simply the use of understanding a woman's cycle from the moment that she's having her period all the way through that cycle, looking at the bleeding patterns, the mucus patterns, to figure out exactly where this woman is ovulating, and then using that timing of the ovulation to look at her hormones and analyze it and compare it to what is normal so that you can then determine if something is wrong. So basically, it helps you to pay attention to all of the signs and symptoms that your body is giving in order to decipher what is going on underneath. Most often, when women go to a gynecologist and they're talking to them about their bleeding patterns or their issues, they don't have time to really get in depth and to ask them, how many days are you bleeding? What is the exact heaviness of each day? What is the color of the bleeding? But it is so important to look at all of those things because everything means something. And with NaPro Technology, they've really spelt it out beautifully. If you're filling a pad in 1 to 3 hours, you have very heavy bleeding, and that could be a sign of a bleeding disorder or crazy high estrogen levels. If you are having tail and brown bleeding at the end of your period, that could be a sign of low progesterone levels, which could complicate future pregnancies and leave you with an increased risk of miscarriage, or it could cause you to have really horrible moods right before your periods that wreak havoc in your marriage. It's so amazing because everything in our cycle, God has provided our bodies with the ability to communicate with us, to really allow us to understand when we're able to pay attention. And so that we can pick up all of these cues, all of these signs and symptoms, and we can interpret them to have a true understanding of exactly what's going on hormonally. If you have an abundance of mucus all the time throughout your cycle, you likely have crazy high estrogen levels. If you have crazy high estrogen levels, you could be at a really high risk for breast cancer, for endometriosis, for fibroids, for heavy bleeding, all of these things. But if you're not paying attention to any of it, you're going to miss all of the signs and symptoms, and you won't have an understanding. And instead, you'll be treated by a typical gynecologist with a contraceptive to shut down all of these signs and symptoms so that you cannot interpret them, and it actually worsens the underlying condition.
So there's a natural dimension you're describing it as, and then there's the pro-life dimension.
Correct.
Now, which was what caused you to shift initially, right?
Yes.
So help us understand what's wrong with the kind of things that are being, typical gynecology exercises, IVF that's being used, contraception, these kinds of things. What's happening there that's not being addressed, and what is NaPro addressing? What problem is it solving?
So if you go to a typical gynecologist, every single issue that you come across the board, whether it be abnormal bleeding, endometriosis, painful periods, mood issues, short cycles, long cycles, the solution for all of it, according to a typical gynecologist, is here, get on this birth control pill. When you get on a birth control pill, you're shutting down your natural cycle and you are worsening your hormones, right? But in addition to that, every time that you use a birth control pill that has hormones in it, you are thinning the inner lining of the uterus. And it's also the main mechanism of action is to try and suppress ovulation, but the secondary mechanism of action is to thin this inner lining of the uterus so that if you do conceive at that time, that embryo finds it very difficult to implant. And if it does implant, it's a higher risk pregnancy. But more often than not, it won't implant, and that's the earliest possible abortion. So that is why we believe that all of these hormonal contraceptives, whether it be contraceptive pills, IUDs with hormones, even the IUDs without hormones that make the inner lining of the uterus inhospitable, the implants, the patches, the rings, all of them can be possible abortifacients. And so we, as Catholics, we absolutely do not want to participate in abortion in any sense. Then you have the idea of IVF. So these women have underlying issues, right? And the underlying issues are covered up by these contraceptives because they've come to their doctor, oh, I have irregular cycles. So rather than addressing the underlying issue of why do you have irregular cycles and let's see what we can do naturally to heal that, they place the contraceptive on top to give them a monthly bleed, which is not an actual ovulation. It's not that you're being allowed to ovulate naturally. It's just that you're taking hormones and then when they stop, you bleed, and then you take hormones again and they stop and you bleed.
Would many women who are using contraception say on that level, though that part of it's working for me? You know what I mean? So there's the natural, the problems, and there's also the abortion problem. But does it actually work in terms of what the doctors say it's going to do for them?
The symptoms improve, right? Okay. So you'll have women that have very heavy bleeding, and now their very heavy bleeding may have resolved, and now they're just having these periods intermittently, or they're just having spotting, so they're not having very heavy bleeding at all. So it appears that things are getting better because their symptoms appear to be better. But unfortunately, it is causing a lot of problems that they're just kind of sweeping under the rug and ignoring. So the minute they stop that contraceptive and they say, okay, now I'd like to get pregnant, all of those initial issues that they're hiding with the contraceptive now rear their head. And then it's gotten worse because you develop more of an estrogen dominance issue. The higher levels of estrogen will suppress your progesterone even further. It makes it much harder for you to conceive pregnancies. So now these women are dealing with infertility, and the doctors are just pushing them towards the IVF doctors. IVF is horrible because with IVF, number one, they're asking the man to create the specimen by using pornography, often in another room, and masturbating. That's completely against our faith. The husband and the wife are not coming together to create this child. That is not something that we want to promote. We want this unification of the husband and the wife in order to create the child. Then they create all of these embryos by hyperstimulating the mother's ovaries with these very strong medications, which could cause more problems for her down the road. They extract all of those eggs, put them in a petri dish with these sperm, create these embryos. So say they create 8 embryos. They can't implant
all. Is that typical?
It could be 4, it could be 6, it could be 8.
Multiple.
Yeah, multiple embryos. They can't implant all of those embryos at once into the mom. So at most they can implant 2. The rest of them have to be frozen. Before they freeze them, they look at them and they grade them. And they say, oh, this one's better grade than that. This one's not the very good grade. We should discard. So already you're discarding embryos. These are parents that desperately want a child and they're already losing children right there. Then they take the ones that are left over and they will freeze those. So then they'll try with the first cycle with the 2 fresh embryos. If those 2 embryos take off like gangbusters and say they both split into twins and now you have 4 babies in there, or even 3 babies, the next step is, well, this is too much. You're going to end up with a very high risk pregnancy. Now we should reduce. Reduce means abort. So now these people who desperately want a child are in a position where they're being scared into the necessity of aborting their own children. And this just goes on and on because
this is a regular reality.
This is
in the IVF process.
It
it's
is
not an outlier that you're talking about. Yeah.
No, this is something that I have heard over and over and over from patients. And then you have the the embryos that have been frozen. So now you're taking 2 of those for the next cycle. And because they've been frozen and now they've been thawed, there's a slightly increased risk of genetic abnormalities and problems because of all the manipulation that happens with IVF. When they do studies of the embryos and of the children that result from these IVF pregnancies, there is a slight increased risk in genetic problems and in cancer and all of these things. And it's something that shouldn't be taken lightly. That being said, I mean, every child that comes from this is still a precious child. Every one of those embryos is still a precious embryo. And I just advise people, rather than taking that route where you have to pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars every single month for one cycle of IVF, look into NaPro Technology. Look into understanding what the root cause of your issue is. Get to the root and understand what you can do to naturally heal your system, rather than investing in doing things that may lead you down the path to
How do you
abortion.
have a woman who comes to you and says, we're desperately trying so hard to have children. My husband wants me to do IVF. I don't know what to do. And is this really this natural approach? Do I have any realistic shot of being able to have a baby? What's it going to do for me and why?
So the studies, when they compare IVF to NaPro Technology, they show that there is so much success with NaPro Technology. It is so beautiful to see. Typically with NaPro Technology, when you are helping a woman to conceive a pregnancy, she's not typically having multiple pregnancies at once. So the pregnancies that are created are singleton pregnancies that are lower risk, and they are easier for the mother to carry. So it's a healthier pregnancy as well. There are definitely studies out there that show the efficacy of NaPro Technology in comparison to IVF, and it's right up there. But the cost is not as much.
Right, yeah.
Unfortunately, there aren't as many NaPro Technology trained physicians as there are IVF physicians. But the beautiful part about NaPro Technology is it's not just the medical aspect, which is what I focus on, but there's also a surgical aspect of NaPro Technology where even the surgeries that they do are different in comparison to what a typical gynecologist does. So a typical gynecologist will go in for endometriosis surgery. Endometriosis is when little bits of the inner lining of the uterus implant outside of the uterus, and it causes a lot of problems for pain, for infertility. The NaPro trained physicians will go in and actually remove the endometriosis, and they will repair things so that you improve the fertility of the woman and you prevent adhesions or things from sticking together, which will make it harder for them to conceive down the road or harder to perform further surgeries if need be. But a typical gynecologist will go in there and they will just burn the endometriosis. So it always comes back and things are always sticking together. So it makes it harder to conceive down the road. So it's very different in their approach to pretty much everything. The approach of trying to get to the root cause and treating the root cause of the issue, for one, but also even in the surgery, it's very much trying to sustain the fertility of the woman. It's never to go in there just to cut off the tubes and to force a person down the road of IVF.
If there's a couples listening to the program, they want to know more about NaPro Technology, where can they go?
So the St. Pope Paul VI Institute in Nebraska is the place that all of the NaPro Technology trained physicians receive their education. So that's the best place to look. But there are also other NaPro trained physicians who may not be listed on their site. So you can always just put in your zip code and type in NaPro Technology on any search on the internet and see what pops up. If you can't get to a NaPro trained physician, I would highly recommend looking at an integrative or a root cause medicine type of physician who's willing to go deep with you and look at your gut health and your liver function and your thyroid in ways other than the typical method of allopathic medicine.
And then how can people find out about, is it Natural Women's Health? Is that the name of your practice?
Our office is naturalwomenshealth.com. So you can always get onto our website, see what we have to offer. You could shoot us messages through our portal, and we would be happy to try and direct you or answer questions for you as well.
Well, we just scratched the surface, and I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Ruberu, for being with us and for really the example that you are. You are on the front lines of the major spiritual battle of our time, the whole human nature. What is a woman? What's a man? When does life begin? All these battles, and you're providing a powerful, powerful alternative. And thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much. It's been such a joy.
Yes. And Dr. Monique's testimony, Rising with Roses, is available at Amazon. You can get it there. I also want to offer you my new booklet called Does God Judge? It's free for the asking. You can just call the number on the screen or go to our website at renewalministries.net. And really, from Genesis to Revelation, a dimension of who God is, God resists evil and wickedness. He sent his son to take it all away, to give it to us. And his mercy triumphs over his justice for all who turn to them in their heart for his mercy, because God fundamentally is love. That's what this booklet's about. God bless you. Hope you can join us again next week. From Genesis to Revelation, the judgment of God is a central biblical theme, yet it's a subject most people want to avoid. Jesus and the apostles remind us that all of us will appear before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account for our lives. For those prepared, it will be a moment of inexpressible joy and total fulfillment. For those unprepared, it will be a moment of great terror. In this short booklet, we will consider God's judgments in history and at our death and upon the Lord's return. My prayer is that this fundamental truth leads you to a deeper conversion and total surrender to His great mercy. Get your first copy for free today by visiting our website or calling the number on the screen.